Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of our Sunday morning Bible study on the Gospel of John. We are studying a fitting text this morning because we're in the season of Easter, so we're going to be studying the raising of Lazarus from the dead, Jesus' greatest miracle in the Gospel of John, besides his own resurrection. And this is a long but united text, so there's really no good way to break it up. So we're gonna do kind of 5 sections through the whole chapter this morning and see all that Jesus is doing in this miracle and how it connects to what comes after it. So let's begin as we always do with a word of prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, open now your word to us, that as we read and study the Gospel according to St. John, we would be led to believe in your Son and all that he has done for us and for the world. Grant us faith and understanding as we read your word in the name and for the sake of Jesus. Amen. John chapter 11. There's really no transition from John chapter 10. It's kind of a brand new thought. So we'll just dive right in. We'll start with verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us go, that we may die with him. So we meet for the first time in the Gospel of John a family who are very close friends of Jesus, Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. You are probably familiar with Mary and Martha from the other Gospels, specifically the Gospel of Luke, which includes the story about Martha being busy about preparing the meal and everything, while Mary sits at the feet of Jesus and listens to him teach. Same family, but this is the first time that we see them in John. And so John is kind of assuming that the readers and the people who would have read this the first time it was written are familiar with this family. They know who these people are. In fact, in verse 2, when he refers to Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, that's an event that he himself will record in chapter 12. So we haven't gotten there yet, but we're assuming that you know that story already. This is just kind of an identifier for that Mary, because there's 800 Marys running around the world in those days. So this is specifically the Mary who anoints Jesus's feet with perfume and wipes them with her tears and her hair. We'll get to that story next week in John. And so the word comes from the two sisters that Lazarus is sick. Now remember that there's no phone calls these days. There's no quick delivery system. And based on where Jesus was at the end of chapter 10, it was probably a 2 to 3 day journey from where he was to Bethany. So it's entirely possible that by the time the messenger with this message leaves to get to Jesus, Lazarus has already died. But what Jesus knows from the messenger is Lazarus is sick. And how does he respond? Well, he says, this sickness does not lead to death. At first glance, this seems incorrect because later on we read Lazarus dies. Does that make Jesus wrong here? No, not exactly. What Jesus is saying here is this sickness does not end in death. In other words, he has known all along that he is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And that's what he is telling his disciples here. Ultimately, this whole thing is happening for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man, that is Jesus himself, can be glorified through this process. Remember that in the Gospel of John, the glory of the Son of Man is always connected to the cross, the crucifixion event. And so we're not talking about kind of the Son of Man becoming popular. We're talking about this event happening so that the Son of Man dies. And there's kind of an odd reversal there. Jesus is going to raise somebody else from the dead so that he himself can die. And then you get the really unusual, hard to interpret saying in verses 5 and 6. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so he stayed where he was 2 days. Jesus stays where he is for 2 days longer because he loves Mary and Martha and Lazarus. This doesn't make any sense to us. What's the point here? Well, the point is simply that Jesus knows that their faith in him will deepen and their salvation will be even more secure by faith if he waits until Lazarus is actually dead. And so that's why he is waiting. The reason that he waits is not an act of indifference or an act of hatred, it's an act of love for these three people. And so then he tells the disciples after those 2 days, hey, it's time to get going back to Judea, where the last time they were there, the Jews threw rocks at his head because he had claimed to be God himself. And so the disciples are very confused why Jesus wants to go back to Judea, where they threw rocks at them last time. And so they say, the Jews just now tried to stone you, and you're going back there. And Jesus gives this really cryptic, odd saying in verses 9 and 10 about light and darkness. Here's the point of that. That is a connection to a previous I am statement of Jesus, I am the light of the world. So what Jesus is saying here is as long as you are with me, the light of the world, as long as it is day, you cannot stumble. In other words, the Jews cannot hurt us. But night is coming. And if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles. And we will get to the point where the light of the world's light goes out temporarily, and then the disciples will scatter and flee for fear of the Jews. But for now, they do not need to fear the Jews because Jesus, the light of the world, is with them. And so once they determine that Lazarus has in fact actually died, Jesus is going there in order to wake him up, raise him from the dead. And Thomas suggests that all of the disciples go with him. Now, Thomas, we meet later on again in the gospel. He's most known for the incident that gets him the nickname Doubting Thomas. From our sermon the second Sunday of Easter, we know that it's really unbelieving Thomas on that point. But here, Thomas actually does very well. He suggests going with Jesus so that they can die with him. This is a big moment of devotion and courage for Thomas. Even if he's not entirely certain why they're going or what's going to happen, he knows that they need to follow Jesus to the end. And so that's exactly what they're going to do. And so we move on to the next section where they actually arrive in Bethany, beginning at verse 17. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." So Jesus arrives in Bethany and learns an important piece of information. Lazarus has already been in the tomb 4 days. And this is important because in the Jewish teaching of those days, when a person died, the soul kind of hovered around the body for 3 days afterwards. And then once the body started to actually decompose and decay, the soul got out of there on the 4th day and left. So this is important because Lazarus is not just mostly dead, he's totally dead. This is not an instance where the Jews could have claimed there was just a recitation of Lazarus. Lazarus is dead. His soul has departed. Jesus is going to raise him from the dead. And so out wanders Martha because she hears that Jesus is coming, and her claim is correct. If Jesus had been there, Lazarus would not be dead. But evaluate the rest of Martha's faith. She says a lot of things that are true. She says, "Whatever you ask from God, God will give you." She knows that her brother will rise again on the resurrection on the last day. She believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. These are all true things. But where is her focus? Her focus is on the future. She's looking to a resurrection on the last day. And Jesus's point in this "I am" statement is, no, I am the resurrection and the life. And if I can raise the dead on that day, I can surely also do it now. And that's what I've come here to do, Martha. Do you believe that? She doesn't quite see it. She confesses a true statement that he is the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world, but she does not believe that he has the power and is about to raise her brother from the dead in the here and now. And Jesus offers that sort of resurrection to all who believe in him. This is the I am statement in verse 25, where he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. That's a statement of final resurrection, coming back to life. The one who believes in him and dies will one day live again. That's the Christian hope. And everyone who lives and believes in Jesus shall never die. Now, those seem at first glance to be contradictory statements, but the second part is saying that the one who lives and believes in Jesus will never experience the spiritual death of separation from God. They will never die the death that Jesus has to die on the cross for them. But Martha doesn't quite grasp this reality. She's close, but she's not there yet. And that's why Jesus has come, is to bring them to a fuller understanding of who he is and what he has come to do in this world. And so we carry on in verse 28. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? We hear in the early portions of this section that there's this group of other people in the house with Mary and Martha. It was Jewish custom, actually a Jewish requirement, that you had to at least hire 2 flute players and a professional wailing woman for any funeral. We know from other places that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were pretty rich. So they probably had more than that. I'm sure they had a rather large band of professional hired mourners whose job it was to wail and mourn and make a lot of noise, which was supposed to comfort the family that was grieving. So Mary runs out of the house, and all these people think she's going to the tomb, so they follow her. But instead, she comes to Jesus and says the exact same thing that her sister Martha had said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Again, a true statement. We're missing out on why Jesus has come in the first place. And so when Jesus sees her weeping and all of the other Jews weeping, the text says that he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. This is an incredibly difficult thing to interpret. The Greek word here involves anger or irritation. So Jesus here is not just like sad that his friend has died. No, he is angry that sin and death have caused this to the people that he loves. And he is angry that Mary and Martha and the rest of the Jews are grieving as those who do not have the hope that Jesus can raise him from the dead in the here and now. This is the same reason why he weeps later on. His anger gives way to grief, and he grieves the fact that they can't see who he is and what he has come to do. The unbelief of the Jews is blinding them to the power that is now standing in front of them to raise Lazarus from the dead. He doesn't cry because his friend is dead. He knew that already. He knew that he came here to raise him from the dead. It doesn't make any sense that Jesus would all of a sudden cry because Lazarus' friend has died. He knows he's going to raise him, but the rest of the people have no clue. And that causes Jesus great sorrow in his heart. But he presses on. Verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." So you note before the actual raising of Lazarus, Jesus does something very specific. He prays to his Father in heaven above, and he thanks his Father for hearing him. What this probably indicates to us is that Jesus had previously asked the Father for permission or checked whether it was the Father's will that Lazarus rise from the dead at this moment. And the Father has heard the Son's prayer. That's consistent with what we've seen in the rest of the Gospel of John, where the Son doesn't do anything apart from the Father's will. So here Jesus is checking in just one more time that this is in fact the will of his Father. And he is emphasizing for the people standing around that this is something, what is about to happen, is something that should cause them to believe that the Father sent Jesus into the world. We'll see if that takes place. But Jesus, with a very word, commands Lazarus to come out of the tomb. He doesn't lay on hands, he doesn't do anything like that. He raises Lazarus with a word of his mouth. We saw in chapter 1, verse 1, that Jesus, one of his names in the Gospel of John is the Word. The Word of God is at work to create and recreate life in the body of Lazarus. And so out the man comes. He's still in his grave clothes, which is rather restrictive because normally people don't rise from the dead. You can kind of bind these bodies up permanently. But he would have had a rather difficult time walking based on how the other documents describe burial procedures. He would have had to hop or kind of penguin shuffle out of the tomb, which is a little bit of an amusing image, him kind of shuffling out, which is why Jesus is so quick to say, "Okay, unbind the guy, let him go so that he can resume his normal, regular life." Remember this, because when Lazarus comes out of the tomb, he is still wrapped in the grave clothes. And we know that later on, Lazarus dies again. The difference will be evident when Jesus rises from the dead. And you'll have to note there what happens with the grave clothes. We'll come to that in a few chapters. For now, Lazarus is alive again. There is no reaction from Mary and Martha. There's no reported reaction in the text. We would assume they are overjoyed and that they believe and trust in Jesus as the resurrection and the life. And some of the Jews do too, but some of them don't. And that's where we get into trouble in the last section of the chapter, beginning at verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know, so that they might arrest him. So this miracle, the raising to life of a man, does not inspire faith in the council, which is called the Sanhedrin or the Sanhedrin. It's the Jewish ruling council of 70 elders of Israel, which are led by the high priest, whose name is Caiaphas. Instead, it causes them to desire to kill Jesus, because they are afraid that if they let Jesus continue on as he has been, he will gather up a group of people that will riot, and the Romans don't take kindly to riots, so the Romans will come in and destroy the temple and take away their positions of leadership and the nation of Israel. So Caiaphas says, it is better for one man to die for the sake of the people, and that the whole nation should perish. This is an interesting twist of irony, and the text says that he unknowingly prophesied this because he was high priest. He means it's better to just get rid of Jesus than that we should lose the entire nation to the Romans. What this actually winds up happening is that Jesus dies for the sins of the world, not just for the sins of the nation of Israel, but for all of God's children who are scattered abroad. That's Jews and Gentiles together. And so this is a brilliant way of God using the evil thoughts and words of men to accomplish his final good purposes. So from that day on, the Sanhedrin is looking for ways to put him to death. And Jesus gets out of town. And he goes and he hangs out in a town called Ephraim near the wilderness. We remember from early on in John chapter 2 at the wedding in Cana, one of the things that Jesus said to his mother was, "My hour has not yet come." And his hour is always connected to the hour of his suffering and death, his passion, the time when he is glorified in the sight of all the people. We will get to a point very soon where the text will tell us, my hour has come. So until that hour comes, Jesus will not be arrested. And so he goes off into the wilderness to avoid the murderous plots of the Sanhedrin. But there are people streaming into Jerusalem from all over the place because it's almost time to celebrate the Passover, the greatest feast of the Jews, the one that remembered the exodus out of slavery in the land of Egypt. And how do they react to these things? Well, they are aware of the Sanhedrin's decision. The chief priests had seemingly given orders about Jesus to the crowds, but they seem rather indifferent in a way to Jesus. There's no profession of faith here. Um, they kind of are impressed by Jesus and they want to see and hear more. But this is the crowd of people that can be easily swayed. And they're going to be swayed from kind of indifference to shouting, crucify him on Good Friday. And so Jesus leaves the region to avoid the death threats of the Sanhedrin, and he will only return when his Father wills him to. Before that point, he is going to go back to the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, which will be where next chapter begins. Chapter 12 begins in the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And then we will have the account of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where his Passion Week, his hour, finally begins. I invite you to look forward to that study coming up next weekend. Again, we'll have the rest of our Bible studies this week. If you have any comments, thoughts, or questions on this study that we did this morning, please feel free to put them in the comments below this video or give me a call here in the office. I would love to chat with all of you about these things that we have studied. And I pray God's richest blessings and peace on all of you throughout this coming week. I will talk to you all again very soon.